Good afternoon. Welcome to the second lecture in our lecture series of the Red Spinel project for graduate students. I'm very happy to see a number of graduate students in our audience and generally see that so many of you are interested in this topic. And it's my particular pleasure to welcome Birgit Peters, who is Professor of Public Law with a focus on international and European law at the University of Trier. And that is, of course, very close to my heart because we share the alma mater in Trier. Only Birgit became a professor there then. And she also did a LLM at King's College London, where I myself also spent some time. So we share actually a broad past and also a passion for, let's say, EU environmental, biodiversity, climate policies in the broadest sense. And Birgit will speak today on the need to revolutionize EU biodiversity protection. And in the context of Red Spinel, of course, we will also try to see this, the need for reform, as part of the growing dissensus, contestation, opposition, populism in Europe on these topics. So if we don't get to that to the full extent in the lecture, we can, of course, press Birgit afterwards in question and answers on what will be the future of biodiversity protection in the European Union, including after the elections this year. Okay, without much further ado, Birgit, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, for that kind introduction and also for inviting me here. I'm truly honored to speak before you as a very learned crowd. And I'm humbled to present some initial ideas on the topic, which grew out of a collaboration of me and biologists at Trier University. So the suggestions I'm going to be making come from the biology colleague of mine and his insights into the analysis of ecosystems and biodiversity. And why I picked the topic, I think, is fairly obvious. The current state of EU biodiversity protection is not very promising. Here's a chart from 2020 on the general biodiversity loss in Europe, and it's 24%, which seems not so much, but if you consider the world and other world regions where we have sort of statistics about biodiversity loss, it's even more. And if you consider also what we have as rules in Europe on European biodiversity protection, it is mostly common consensus that they are inefficient and not fulfilling their promises. The EU Commission themselves said in their assessment of their two directives that regulate biodiversity protection, the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, that those two directives weren't fulfilling the objectives of the directives, and they weren't able to address the emerging problems. And even despite that in 2020, the Commission had already set up a biodiversity strategy where it proclaimed to halt the loss of biodiversity by 2020. We see still plummeting numbers and biodiversity loss, and therefore we are looking, as some authors have concluded, at a lost decade of biodiversity protection in Europe. So I will today reflect on some of those deficits and point to how biodiversity protection could be improved. Essentially, I would argue that biodiversity law needs to adapt to current Earth systems and biodiversity research, and all of them concentrate on the systemic approach, which highlights the systemic relevance of species for a particular ecosystem. And that's what I think should be implemented in future biodiversity law. I'll first illustrate a bit the current framework of EU biodiversity protection for those of you in the room who are not familiar with it. And then I'll highlight what is problematic about biodiversity protection as it stands already. And then I'll outline some of the entries for reform, mainly highlighting that we need to change the aim of biodiversity protection and we need to modify central instruments. And after that, I'll hopefully conclude. So let me start with the current framework of EU biodiversity protection. Essentially, we have two directives that regulate biodiversity in Europe. One is the oldest directive that the EU has on environmental matters, the Birds Directive. It's been reformed in 2009, but it's been around since 1979. And that's why it's a very old framework. It includes the protection of wild birds, including migratory species, which is quite novel because it addresses a species that is just temporarily here, and then they go away, and the directive addresses those species nevertheless, which is comprehensive and quite novel. It was concluded at a time when it was very popular to hunt birds in Europe, and that's why it addressed
18th century.
No, also for food reasons, right? So we still we had in Europe had a concrete problem that we wanted to eat wild birds, and that's why it was set up in 1979, and that's why it's there, and it has a two-tier system. One lists the birds and the species that are going to be protected, and the other one lists the habitats, and it addresses individual species protection and the setting up of conservation areas, so-called special protection areas. And the list system indicates what are the species that are to be protected. And the main protection instrument then is the protected areas, of which the member states have to designate areas when there's birds actually in their territory that need protection. There's another quite important prohibition of individual takings and the destructions of eggs and nests. So you have this individual species protection, where you say you can't even touch a single species of a particular bird in that case, and it's prohibited. And the Court of Justice of the European Union is interpreting this prohibition, as well as the obligation to establish protected areas quite strictly. For example, they say that only for birds reasons, sorry, I can't pronounce it properly, can you designate that particular protected area, and there's also only reasons pertaining to the birds why you are not allowed to set it up. So there's no economic reasons, for example, that allows states to derogate from this obligation to set up protected areas. And that's quite special about the Birds Directive, that you have these strict criteria where you can't derogate from setting up, for example, these protected areas. And then we have like the Birds Directive addressing only birds, and then the Habitats Directive addresses biodiversity as such. And that's also quite important. It addresses biodiversity in itself. It doesn't say ecosystems. That's something which is important because it was adopted at the same time as the International Convention on Biodiversity on Biological Diversity, the CBD, in 1992. But the CBD has an express ecosystem approach, where they say this is an ecosystem and we need to protect ecosystems. Whereas the Habitats Directive, which was adopted in the same year, doesn't have that approach. It speaks of biodiversity, which at some point has to be criticized by authors, because they say it's an artificial word, because it has this normative approach of having a diverse flora and fauna, but it doesn't really say how to protect them. So what does the Biodiversity Directive do, the Habitats Directive? It's very similar to the Birds Directive, because it has this individual species protection approach, as well as the protected areas approach. And there's two ways to establish protected areas. One is areas of special interest, which can be established by the state if they have a particular species in their territory that has a particular habitat that needs to be protected. And the other approach is if you have an area of community interest. There's also a special list. For example, you have a particular shoreline or you have wetlands, and the community itself, the European community, designated these areas to be worthy of protection. And then you need to notify to the Commission that you want to protect this area as a state. And then this is enlisted in the Natura 2000 framework. And the Habitats Directive itself has the aim of establishing a comprehensive approach of protected areas all over Europe, encompassing this minimum amount of diverse habitats, so that each habitat, in a way, is protected throughout the European Union. The Habitats Directive also includes the protected areas that are established under the Birds Directive. So you have a comprehensive network of different protected areas. That's at least the intention. And we have the community habitats, which are already alluded to, that have to be notified to the Commission. And their main approach is also that you have some priority species in them. So there's the habitat is either to be declared when it's particularly important due to criteria that are described, that they are rare or that they are very particular, as the wetlands example that I gave. But you could also find a species that is quite rare in the whole of Europe, and that's why there's an obligation to designate that habitat as an area of community importance. And then again, now having gone to the protected areas framework, there's this individual species approach where you have rules addressing single species protection and the prohibition of individual takings or picking if it's a plant, and this or generally the destruction of essential habitat features. So that's the status quo of the two directives. I need to say a bit more about the exceptions to the establishment of protected areas. There is, in contrast to the Birds Directive, which I said is quite strict on allowing only ornithological reasons for not protecting birds. The Habitats Directive in itself allows the going through with projects and plans and programs that affect the habitat of a particular species for overriding public interests. And the overriding public interest can be economical or social reasons. So there's this exception in the directive, and I'll point out in the following why it's problematic. Obviously, if you look at what these directives do and how the directives regulate biodiversity protection, as I said in the beginning, they have remained rather ineffective. Biodiversity loss in Europe is in full decline. So you can say there's need to do more. In my view, there are also two other reasons why we need to address biodiversity protection. For the first reason being that we have in these two directives no defined aim. The directive, the Habitats Directive, addresses biodiversity, as I said in the beginning. Interestingly, it doesn't address ecosystem protection, right? So we have a problem of what is it actually for? Like, what is the central aim of the directive? And we also have a limited biodiversity protection due to the list systems established by the two directives. I haven't said that before, but for example, the Habitat Directive doesn't include fungi, which sounds rather, why do we need to protect fungi? They are there everywhere. But
people in the fungi, it's
Obviously, we have an important symbiosis of certain fungi, for example, with trees, and that's why we need to think about, certain species that are relevant to others. And the Habitats Directive, for example, ignores those interconnections. So the decision to put some species on the list mostly has to do with their status as endangered or threatened species, which is fine as itself, but it doesn't include interconnections to other species. So that's a problem concerning the aim. And then there's three main problems, and then I will address mostly the Habitats Directive. The Habitats Directive has a limited approach to restoration. That's one problem, where we now have a suggestion of the European Commission to address that in the nature restoration law. And then the second problem is that we have overriding economic or social considerations, which still may go through with certain plans and projects. And in my view, we are missing also red lines where we, or the member states rather, definitely know when not to touch on certain habitats or species. And I'll come to that in the following. On the one hand, you can say the Habitats Directive builds on the concept of biodiversity, which itself is artificial. As I said in the beginning, biodiversity addresses bias, and it has a very spatial approach. It says that something must be diverse within a certain space. And usually, if you consider, for example, ecosystem protection, ecosystems are not perceived as within a certain space. Obviously, an ecosystem needs a certain space, but an ecosystem can be very small, and it's dependent on the interconnection of species in itself, but it's not dependent on a particular space. And the Habitats Directive as well as Birds Directive assume that somehow we need to have this space, and if we have the space and the area is designated for protection, then the species will thrive. And that's problematic if we don't implement proper deterioration prohibitions, for example, or restoration prohibitions, then the habitat will stay in the state that has been designated at the time when it was designated, but it will neither improve nor can we ensure that some species that are in the habitat will actually multiply and thrive. So this is one of the problematic aspects. The second problematic aspect is that you build on a system where the species are rare and where the individual species that is rare counts, and that you don't look to the interconnections why the species is actually in decline. So it's based on the danger of disappearance, on habitat, but the interconnections between the actual species are not important enough. And the ecosystem approach of the Convention on Biodiversity doesn't have this particular approach. It looks to the ecosystem and doesn't have these spatial components. So that is something which is to be considered. And this
Can I just I think you said it, but just to confirm, so it's on the basis of Habitat Directive that we have the Nature 2000, the areas.
the areas, yes.
Okay.
And the Birds Directive areas go into this whole framework of Natura 2000. So you have an overarching framework of areas, but they comprise both of the birds and the Habitats Directive. Yes. So now if we say the ecosystem approach is relevant, then there's diverse approaches also in the EU that already take into account this ecosystem approach. For example, the EU Biodiversity strategy and also the proposal for a nature restoration law both have this ecosystem approach. What is particularly about this ecosystem approach? The ecosystem approach says that you set in place as a regulator the procedure and instrumental requirements so that ecosystems in itself, the interaction of species with each other, can be guaranteed. It is also interesting because the ecosystem approach leads us to consider which are the priorities in these interactions. So every society may have certain priorities why they want to protect certain species and others not, and certain areas and others not. As I said in the directive, there may be projects, great infrastructure projects, there may be particular other projects like planning, building that need to be considered. So obviously you always have to balance proper species interaction and other criteria. And an ecosystem approach perceives man as us as integrated with other species. So as we are all part of an ecosystem, we can have these balancing decisions, and it's okay to have them in a way, right? So the actual change and the insights that we have from science on ecosystems can all be taken into account when relying on an ecosystem approach, because man is part of this natural ecosystem. That is quite important because you can have different priority decisions and you can also realize different priority decisions. And also, if we look to the further aims of biodiversity regulation, we need to take into account not only what are our societal preferences, like what do we want to realize if we want to do biodiversity regulation, but also what does science say about the whole approach. And my argument would be that we need to take into account system science at large and biodiversity science as well. And I would want to illustrate this in the next two slides. Generally, why is Earth system science important? This is a concept, Earth system science, I don't know whether you've heard about it, that operates on the basis that we have 9 essential systems that maintain the status of our planet as such. The systems are biosphere integrity, climate change, novel entities, freshwater change, for example, ocean acidification, those that you actually see on the slide behind me. And the Earth system research is currently at the state where they say that 6 of 9 planetary boundaries have been overstepped. Why is this approach important? It says that it has a threshold approach and that you can actually try to measure when certain boundaries are overstepped, so that you can say when the status of Earth is in a critical state. And what does it mean if it's in a critical state? It's in a critical state if we can't predict anymore how systems interact, if we have, for example, in the climate sector, great climatic events, weather changes, desertification, all of that. And in Earth system science, there's now a group of authors, and I've provided the source here, that operate on the basis that they say we need to recognize planetary commons for the protection of large-scale ecosystems. For example, like the Amazon, to prevent tipping points in Earth's system. And what does it mean? Essentially, they want to communitarize essential ecosystems like the rainforest, so that they say they are so important for planetary health, we need to prevent them. And that's also one insight I think European biodiversity protection should take into account. And this ecosystem approach takes into account the interactions of biodiversity with other Earth systems. Biodiversity is not a sort of aim in itself, it is obvious that it interacts, for example, with climate change, and that climate change also affects biodiversity. And I put that on the slide here. It predicts for the global heating of 1.5, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees what happens to mammals in this case. And if we have a global heating of 3 degrees, 41% of mammals are losing their habitat. So it's quite obvious that we have an interconnection of the different systems, and future biodiversity regulation would need to take this into account. But obviously, this is only one interconnection. The climate change and biodiversity one is like the most obvious, and it has already been addressed by authors. But it's also quite obvious that it's not the only one. For example, if you have pollutants, obviously also mammals or other species are going to be affected by it. So it's clear that this whole approach by Earth system science is actually reflecting the different systems and the interconnections, and that we need to take this into account. On the other hand, we also need to account the very small scale interconnection of species with each other. And there's a very interesting example that has been researched already in 1966, and it's on the example of starfish and the relevance of starfish in an ecosystem. And I like to cite this firstly because my colleague always cites it, he's a biologist, but also because it reflects like what the current state of micro biodiversity protection is about. And the experiment is as follows. You have the starfish obviously in a marine environment, and if you extract just the starfish, the marine environment will loosen the biodiversity, the diversity from 20 species to 8. Just if you take the starfish out of the equations. And that's an example of how species interaction happens in a system, in a marine system, but it's very obvious that it happens in other systems too. My colleague, who is also working with trees, has found out that every tree has their own little ecosystem, and that if you replace, for example, a pine tree by other trees, that the insects on the tree itself will be changing. So right now in Germany, we are talking about replacing our whole pine tree forests with other forests, because the pine tree is suffering so much from drought that it can't survive, given the global warming. And now we have to think about the fact that with the replacement of other tree species, we will also have a completely different ecosystem in the forest. So that's something that is like relevant on the micro scale, and that will be also relevant for biodiversity protection, because the starfish experiment shows us, yeah, the starfish is actually relevant. So my argument would be that possibly we don't need to focus so much on every species in an ecosystem, but also on the species that are relevant for the ecosystem. And the broad spectrum DNA methods that my colleague implements can also show which species is actually relevant for the ecosystem, like the starfish, for example. So the plea would be to consider that. Now, what do we do? Like, what does the general system of EU biodiversity protection need to look like? First, we need to work on central assumptions and instruments. As I said, we need to look to the specific and systematic relevance of birds and species. We need to concentrate on which is the actual starfish and which are the other species. And maybe put the starfish then on the red list, and not only all the other threatened and endangered species, which may be relevant, but which are not of priority relevance. And that's why we also need to reform the priority species under the EU ecosystem framework, the EU biodiversity regulation, because it operates already with priority species, but then the priority species needs to be the systematically relevant species and not, just the threatened species or the species that is beautiful or something like that. And that entails then that we need to reform the list system to take the systematic relevance into account, to concentrate also on other species that are not listed on the list, like fungi, which I said in the beginning, and that we need to take into account also the macro level, namely what ecosystems are relevant for Earth systems. Like, is there an ecosystem that is so relevant for climate change, for example, that it's of particular importance to preserve that ecosystem. And that is something that has been taken into account partly in the new biodiversity strategy of 2030 by the Commission, but here the Commission just addressed climate change. But I would argue you would need to address all Earth systems. You would need to address pollutants, for example, and not only the interconnection of biodiversity with climate change. So that's the first starting point. The second starting point is to address very specifically the criteria that we have in the Habitats Directive. As I said before, we have in the Habitats Directive the possibility to weigh the impact on certain species that are endangered against economically and socially economic and social reasons. And it's very difficult to actually have a project not prevail, because even the European Court of Justice is very reluctant to say that there's a red line of when a project doesn't need to be realized. The directive allows the project to go through if the member state enacts compensation methods for these species that are affected by the project. You sometimes hear that if the species are then relocated, the bug is found and then the bug is being brought to another area and then the area is protected and that's fine, right? So the actual project can come through. And I would say, based on the fact that we now need to consider the systematic relevance of certain species and also the systematic relevance in a more greater sense, considering Earth system science, then we need to somehow say that there's a red line, right? That some species are so important that we can't just apply compensation methods and relocate the species to another project. And either it would be actually saying that if it affects a certain systematically relevant species, then the project can simply not go through, or it would be relevant to call that species with protection, and only if it has an equal level of protection, then the project can go through. There's obviously ways to discuss that. And also we need to think about the criteria for single species protection. Now I've discussed these exceptions to habitats and the designation of protected areas, but there's also, as you remember, the single species protection that is provided by both directives, where you can't take individual species or don't destroy the eggs. But obviously you would need to address that also to systematically relevant species and to their interconnections. So that you either say you can not take systematically relevant species at all, and also extend the list of prohibited activities to ecosystems and not only to the species list. Those are the two possibilities where we need reform for single species protection. And that makes, let me come to the final points of my talk. I hope that I have illustrated why I think it's important to think about biodiversity protection in different ways. And I think that we are at a point in time where we actually need to reform the framework of EU biodiversity protection in a general sense, both looking at Earth system sciences and at individual species protection, and that the spatial approach of the EU biodiversity directive is not fit for purpose. It only looks to habitats and it doesn't take an ecosystem approach, and I think that's problematic. And I argue that we need to include this ecosystems approach into biodiversity projection with focus on these two important insights, namely on Earth system sciences and on systematic biodiversity projection, and modify the rules accordingly, in particular those concerning projects and single species protection. Thank you very much.